And then at 9:30, which was the time that I thought, right, I need to check, I stood up, and at the same time Matt stood up.
No, you stay.
Matt and Rachel were actually staying in the apartment next to us, 5B.
On the night of May 3rd, 2007, in the quiet coastal town of Praia da Luz, Portugal, the world's attention would be drawn to a mystery that has never been fully resolved. A 3-year-old girl, Madeleine McCann, vanished from her holiday apartment while her parents dined just steps away. The case would ignite global headlines, spawn countless theories, and fracture public opinion. Yet, nearly 2 decades later, one of the most haunting elements is not what was said, but what remains unsaid. Madeleine's disappearance did not occur in isolation. Her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, were vacationing with a group of close friends, 7 adults who became known as the Tapas Seven. They shared dinners, childcare routines, and an evening filled with small, ordinary choices that would later be scrutinized under the harshest possible light. When Madeleine vanished, the group's voices should have been the clearest guides to understanding what happened that night. Instead, their collective silence and inconsistencies created more questions than answers. Why did their statements shift? Why do some details contradict one another, while others seem carefully synchronized? Why, for 17 long years, have none of these friends spoken publicly about that night? Was their silence an act of loyalty to one another, a pact formed out of fear, or simply the natural instinct to protect themselves from a storm they could not control? The tragedy of a missing child is devastating enough on its own, but here, layered on top of grief, is a fog of human psychology, group dynamics, memory lapses, fear of blame, and the unspoken pressure to maintain a united front. Investigators, journalists, and the public have all asked the same haunting question. Is the Tapas Seven's silence the key to unlocking the truth, or merely the echo of panic and self-preservation? As we step into this story, we are not just examining the disappearance of a child. We are entering the fragile terrain of human behavior under extreme pressure, where silence can speak louder than words, and where one open sliding door might symbolize the boundary between fact, memory, and fear. This is the story of Madeleine McCann, and the silence that continues to surround her. Every disappearance has a timeline, a series of moments that investigators cling to in order to piece together the truth. In the case of Madeleine McCann, the last confirmed sighting of her outside her immediate family came around 6:30 p.m. on May 3rd, 2007. David Payne, a close friend of the McCanns and one of the Tapas Seven, stated that he stopped by the McCanns' apartment between 6:30 and 6:40 in the evening. According to his account, he saw Kate with the children. Madeleine, he claimed, was alive, well, and ready for bed. On paper, this moment became a cornerstone of the narrative. It anchored the timeline, giving both police and the public reassurance that Madeleine was accounted for shortly before the adults went to dinner. But beyond Payne's words, no independent witness ever confirmed her presence after 6:30. No hotel staff, no neighbors, no passers-by, only the memories of those within the circle. From 6:40 onward, Madeleine's existence in that apartment relied solely on the accounts of the McCanns and their friends. This fragile reliance on a single person's statement carried enormous weight. If Payne's observation was accurate, it created a narrow window of just over 3 hours for the abduction or disappearance to occur. But if Payne was mistaken, or worse, if his statement was constructed or misremembered, the timeline widened alarmingly, leaving a void where doubt could grow. Without that keystone, nearly everything else becomes unstable. At around 7:00 p.m., Jerry McCann returned briefly to the apartment after playing tennis, then rejoined his friends. By 8:35, both he and Kate left their children sleeping and walked the short path to the Tapas bar. According to their story, they trusted a system of informal checks to ensure all the children in their group were safe. But by 10 p.m., Kate returned to the apartment and found Madeleine gone. Between Payne's claimed sighting and Kate's discovery, there exists an unsettling 3.5-hour gap with no verified evidence of Madeleine's condition or whereabouts. Investigators later uncovered a handwritten timeline, scribbled on the back of one of Madeleine's storybooks. It listed who checked the children, when, and what they observed. But crucially, this timeline was not written during dinner. It was created after Madeleine had already been reported missing, but before the group was formally interviewed by police. To some, This was an innocent act of panicked parents and friends trying to recall details amidst chaos. To others, it was a red flag, a potential attempt to align stories before outside scrutiny arrived. Psychologists call this phenomenon memory reconstruction. Under stress, especially within tight-knit groups, recollections are shaped not only by what individuals remember, but also by what they hear from others. In such moments, truth and suggestion can merge until even the speaker is no longer certain of which is which. This raises unsettling questions. Was Payne's account of seeing Madeleine truly his memory, or did it become the memory the group needed? Was the timeline on the storybook a desperate attempt at order, or an improvised shield against suspicion? When one statement forms the foundation for an entire investigation, the collapse of that statement doesn't just expand a window of time, it dismantles trust in everything that follows. And so, as night fell over Praia da Luz, the disappearance of a little girl was no longer just about who last saw her. It became about who dared to say they did, and whether the world should believe them. The Tapas Seven repeatedly emphasized that they had created a system to ensure their children's safety during the evenings. According to their statements, while they dined at the tapas bar just a short walk from their apartments, each adult would take turns leaving the table every 20 to 30 minutes to check on the sleeping children. It was presented as a careful, responsible arrangement, a routine that allowed them to enjoy their holiday while still fulfilling parental duty. But beneath the surface, this so-called system begins to unravel. One of the group's earliest assertions was that their apartment doors had been securely locked whenever they left for dinner. This detail was critical. Locked doors implied responsibility, an effort to protect their children even in their absence. More importantly, it created a contrast between themselves and Kate and Jerry McCann, who admitted to leaving their sliding glass patio door unlocked for convenience. Yet, the very architecture of the Ocean Club apartments raised troubling questions. The sliding doors could only be locked from the inside. If the parents left through those doors and pulled them shut behind them, they would remain unlocked. The only way to properly lock an apartment was to exit through the front door and use a key from the outside. That reality creates a logistical problem. If every apartment was truly locked, then the rotation of checks would have required keys to be passed around constantly. Every adult would need access not only to their own unit, but to those of their friends. And yet, no one ever mentions such a system. There are no statements about exchanging keys, no recollections of fumbling with locks, no acknowledgement that checking on each other's children would have been far more complicated than casually walking down a short path. This contradiction suggests one of two possibilities. Either the doors were not actually locked, despite the group's insistence, or the entire system of organized checks was less consistent than described. The significance of this detail cannot be overstated. If the doors were left unlocked, every parent in that group would be vulnerable to the same accusations of negligence that fell so heavily on the McCanns. And so, emphasizing locked doors became more than just a detail. It became a collective defense mechanism. An overlooked voice in this puzzle is Diane Webster, the elderly mother of Fiona Payne. Unlike the others, she was not directly responsible for young children and did not participate in the rotation. Later reports suggest she was surprised by the idea of parents leaving their children alone at night and relying on such a system at all. Her hesitation is telling. Why would she find it unusual if it had been routine all along? Unless perhaps the routine was not as established as the group later claimed. Only one member, Matt Oldfield, was clearly documented as leaving the table to check on the McCann children that night. Even then, his account shifted. First, he claimed to have looked into the bedroom and seen the children. Later, he revised his statement, saying he had only listened at the door. Such inconsistencies, paired with the improbability of locked doors and key exchanges, call into question not just what was remembered, but what was constructed. The group's story, on the surface, was one of responsibility. Parents enjoying dinner while taking turns to ensure their children were safe. But peel back the layers, and it begins to resemble something else. A fragile arrangement, hastily reinforced after disaster struck, designed not necessarily to reflect the truth, but to shield everyone from blame. When tragedy strikes, people often react not with clarity, but with fear. For the Tapas Seven, fear became the silent thread weaving their statements together. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann was not just a nightmare for her parents, but for the entire group of friends dining that night. Each of them had left young children asleep in their apartments. Each of them faced the possibility that their choices could be painted as negligence, and each of them understood that, in the glare of media scrutiny, one small admission could unravel them all. The psychology of self-preservation is a powerful force. Faced with the prospect of being judged by police, by the press, by the world, it often feels safer to align with the group than to stand apart. Breaking with the collective narrative risks drawing suspicion, even if the truth is on your side. In Praia da Luz, unity was survival, and unity demanded silence. Consider the case of Matt Oldfield. At first, he told investigators he had looked into the McCann apartment around 9:30 p.m. and seen the children sleeping peacefully. That detail seemed reassuring, anchoring the night's timeline. But later, his account changed. He admitted he had not actually seen Madeleine at all. He had only stood by the door and listened for sounds of sleep. The shift may appear small, but it shattered what had been considered a key confirmation. If he had never seen her, then the timeline was weaker than ever. Another layer of uncertainty came from Jane Tanner. At approximately 9:15 p.m., she claimed to have seen a man carrying a small child away from the McCann apartment. This sighting became the foundation of the abduction theory. Yet, at the very moment Jane said she walked past, Jerry McCann was outside speaking with a neighbor, Jez Wilkins. Neither man recalled seeing Jane, and she did not recall seeing them. How could three adults be in the same spot, at the same moment, and not notice one another? The contradiction was startling, and yet it was never resolved. These inconsistencies did not automatically prove deception, but they did reveal how fragile memory can be under stress, and how dangerous it is to speak against the tide of a group already under fire. One misplaced detail could transform a friend into a suspect. One contradiction could turn into an accusation. The fear of being singled out was enough to bind them together in silence. This is the essence of what some have called the pact of silence. It does not require a conspiracy or a secret agreement. It requires only fear. Fear that honesty could make things worse. Fear that deviation could bring ruin. When truth threatens stability, silence becomes the safer choice. In the McCann case, the Tapas Seven may not have hidden a crime, but they certainly protected themselves from exposure. They may not have agreed on every detail, but they understood one thing instinctively. Their survival depended on coherence. And so, whether through deliberate omission or quiet conformity, their words aligned just enough to withstand the storm. But silence, while protective, is also corrosive. It leaves gaps that suspicion seeps into, and gaps that, even 17 years later, remain unfilled. When investigators pieced together the events of May 3rd, they were struck by a simple, unsettling fact. There was no official, reliable timeline created in real time. Instead, what surfaced was a handwritten list of checks, end times scribbled on the back of one of Madeleine's own storybooks. This detail alone raises difficult questions. The document was produced after she had already been reported missing, but before the group gave formal statements to police. Was it a desperate attempt to bring order to chaos, or a subtle alignment of stories meant to withstand interrogation? Psychologists describe this phenomenon as memory reconstruction. Memory is not a perfect record of the past. It is fluid, vulnerable to suggestion, and easily reshaped under pressure. In groups, especially when fear and shock are present, this effect multiplies. One person recalls an event a certain way, and others, uncertain of their own recollection, adopt that version as if it were their own. Over time, these merged accounts harden into a single narrative, regardless of whether it reflects the truth. This process is known as memory contamination, and it is critical to understanding the contradictions in the McCann case. The Tapas Seven's memories were further clouded by circumstance. The group had been drinking wine throughout the evening, by some accounts, several bottles over the course of dinner. In an ordinary setting, no one would pay close attention to who left the table, when, or for how long. But once tragedy struck, those casual, blurred recollections became the foundation of a police investigation. What was once unimportant, minute-by-minute movements, conversations at the table, even the direction someone walked, suddenly carried the weight of life and death. The Portuguese police made a crucial mistake in those early hours. Instead of immediately separating the group and interviewing each member individually in their native language, they allowed them to remain together. The chance to capture raw, unfiltered memory was lost. By the time formal statements were taken, The group had already spoken among themselves, even casually, enough to harmonize their recollections. What investigators received was not necessarily false, but it was already shaped by group influence. Consider the shifting testimony of Jane Tanner. Her account of seeing a man carrying a child at 9:15 became a cornerstone of the abduction theory. But when other witnesses in the same location failed to corroborate her, doubts arose. Was her memory authentic, or was it reshaped in the hours and days after, reinforced by the group's shared conviction that an abduction must have occurred? Similarly, Matt Oldfield's change from "I saw the children" to "I only heard them" illustrates how recollections can erode or be modified under scrutiny. Even seemingly minor discrepancies, whether someone left the table for 5 minutes or 15, became magnified when waiters' statements conflicted with the group's. Such differences may have been honest errors, the natural result of stress and alcohol. But in a case with no physical evidence, every small inconsistency opened a wider gap for speculation and doubt. Ultimately, the blurred timeline was not just a byproduct of poor memory. It was the outcome of human psychology colliding with crisis. Under stress, people cling to coherence, even if it comes at the cost of accuracy. In Praia da Luz, the timeline may not reflect what actually happened, but rather what needed to be believed by the friends, by the parents, and perhaps even by investigators desperate for a narrative that held together. And so, the truth of that night may be hidden not in lies, but in the fog of memory itself. A fog so thick that, nearly 2 decades later, it is never fully lifted. In the years since Madeleine McCann vanished, the silence of the Tapas Seven has become almost as infamous as the disappearance itself. While Kate and Jerry McCann stepped into the public eye, giving interviews, writing books, appearing on television, and pleading for their daughter's return, their friends withdrew completely. Not one of them has sat down for a major media interview about that night. Not one has offered personal testimony outside the controlled environment of police statements. Their absence has become a silence that echoes louder with each passing year. The reasons for that silence may be more practical than sinister. Most members of the Tapas Seven were highly educated professionals, many of them physicians. For people with careers built on reputation and trust, being associated with one of the world's most controversial missing child cases was a risk that could never be fully erased. A single careless word in front of cameras could mean professional ruin. Silence, then, was not only a shield, it was a necessity. Yet the silence also invites suspicion. Some analysts believe it hints at an unspoken pact, not written or formalized, but deeply understood. Do not contradict the group, do not create fractures, do not become the outlier. Early police statements from the group were remarkably aligned, some say too aligned to be organic. The consistency itself became a source of doubt, as if the voices of 7 different people had blurred into one collective script. There were exceptions. Diane Webster, the elderly mother of Fiona Payne, occasionally expressed uncertainty about the so-called rotation of child checks. Her hesitation suggested that the practice may not have been as established as the others later claimed. But even those faint cracks in the story never widened into open dissent. The weight of conformity was simply too strong. For 17 years, that silence has endured. It does not prove guilt, nor does it absolve anyone. What it does reveal is the immense pressure of self-preservation. Whether driven by fear of legal exposure, professional collapse, or the stigma of public suspicion, the Tapas Seven chose to vanish from the narrative they once stood at the center of. In doing so, they left behind an unanswered question that hangs over the case like a shadow. Did they stay quiet because they knew too much, or because they never truly knew anything at all? The disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains one of the most haunting child mysteries of modern times. Yet beyond the question of what happened to her lies a deeper lesson about memory, fear, and the fragile line between truth and survival. On May 3, 2007, a sliding glass door was left unlocked, a child was left alone, and a group of friends tried to balance leisure with responsibility. When tragedy struck, what unfolded was not only the desperate search for a missing girl, but the equally desperate search for a story that could hold together. The timeline that emerged was never built on hard evidence. There were no surveillance cameras, no digital timestamps, no independent witnesses. Instead, the investigation rested on shifting recollections, hurried notes scribbled on the back of a child's book, and statements that changed under scrutiny. In such an environment, truth became a moving target, shaped as much by fear of blame as by actual memory. Silence became the group's strongest weapon and its most enduring legacy. Not necessarily because they conspired to hide a crime, but because speaking might have exposed them to consequences they could not bear. Negligence, professional shame, legal exposure, each possibility loomed large. And so, the Tapas Seven locked arms not through a formal pact, but through the unspoken understanding that unity was safer than honesty. In that silence, suspicion flourished. 17 years on, no confession has been made, no definitive truth revealed. Perhaps only 2 or 3 people from that group of 9 truly know what happened that night. Perhaps the others were caught in the fog of confusion and memory contamination, repeating a story that sounded right rather than one they could swear was true. And perhaps the silence has endured not because of guilt, but because of fear. Fear that breaking it now would cause more harm than good. The unanswered questions still linger. Who really saw Madeleine last? What moments were reconstructed rather than remembered? And will anyone ever step forward with the courage to pierce the silence? Until then, the case of Madeleine McCann is not just the story of a missing child. It is the story of how truth can vanish as easily as a little girl on a spring evening in Portugal. A story where the most telling sound may be the silence that refuses to break.